Dr. Salgado and Dr. Berntsen, thank you both so much for coming on Silver Sage Magazine today and talking about your research that you've been doing.
Thanks for having us and for inviting.
Yeah.
Sure. So you are both in Denmark, and before we talk about your research, just give me a quick blurb about each of you, what university you're working out of from Denmark, and just kind of a short synopsis of your bio. So Dr. Salgado, I'll let you go first.
Oh, well, thank you. We're working at Aarhus University, located at Aarhus City.
Okay.
And we're part of the Center on Autobiographical Memory Research. The daughter is the leader of that center, and I guess that she's going to talk about it a little bit more in depth. As for bio, I don't know what kind of information do you want me to provide?
Well, you said you're originally from Mexico, but now you're living in Denmark. That's a switch. So your education, perhaps.
Okay. Oh, my education is just a journey by itself. A long story short is that I'm educated in communication sciences, but I was, meanwhile I was working in marketing, I was trying to understand a little bit more of all these, the mechanisms that are going behind our decisions. How is that we go for this product or this other brand instead of the other one, right? And therefore I was looking for some more like in-depth programs, and I found myself some programs here in Denmark. To do my master, I came here, so I have a master's degree in cognitive sciences.
Okay.
And later on, I found Doris research in the center, so it's when I came here and switched to the psychology side.
Okay. So is it Dr. Salgado or Mr. Salgado?
It's doctors. Yeah, well, as for April, it's doctor.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Very nice. And Dr. Berntsen, what about you?
Well, I am a professor in psychology here in Aarhus University, and I am the leader of the Center on Autobiographical Memory Research, which is a center funded by the Danish National Research Foundation for a 10-year period. And we are about 35 people who are involved with studying autobiographical memory from a number of different perspectives. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. It's interesting to me that there's actually a center for this.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a very narrow field. So it's kind of interesting. I'm assuming that your center is one of the only ones in the world that.
Yeah. It is, but we don't think the field is narrow. But it is true that it is probably maybe the only really big center on autobiographical memory research in the world. It's a center of excellence. It's funded by the Excellence Program of the Danish National Research Foundation. So it's a generous grant over 10 years.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
I wonder, and maybe we'll circle back to this, but I know there's a lot of research in memory with music, and if you guys see that connection with autobiographical memory and music in your populations that you study.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That'll maybe we'll circle back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Here we're talking about the published research that you recently did. I found very fascinating. Tell me about this. So basically, you did some research on the correlation between individuals' self-image and their future orientation.
Yes, that's true.
And tell me what you both found.
Well, what we basically found is that theory has it that the younger you are, the more into the future that you can project. And this is basically like a common assumption, given that the younger you are, the more years you have ahead from you to live. And the older you are, the shorter the future you're going to have in front of you. So it's been commonly assumed that this is going to be a negative correlation, such as younger adults project themselves into the future, like further comparison to older adults. So what we found is that when we're thinking about futures of images, which means what the the kind of concepts that you are thinking about yourself into the future that you will become. And we asked people across different age groups about this. We find actually what we found is that there was no difference between the young, the middle age, and the older adults.
Okay, and you mentioned those self-images that we think about into our future. What are those images that you used as part of your research? Because I'm thinking about myself and I'm thinking, you know, self-image into my future. I'm thinking about my physical activity level, perhaps, you know, my economic comfort living situation, perhaps in terms of an economic sense. What other, is that what you were thinking of and what you researched, or what other images were you talking about?
In this case, like some research manipulate the kind of images that they ask people, but this time we decided to leave it open and then to ask for future selves images. So we prompt people with the questions, in the future I will be, and then leave a blank space so people were freely generating these self-images without us controlling what kind or what type. And people provided a different kind of images from I will be healthy, as you said, I will be doing exercise, I will be a gardener, a grandpa, a father, a journalist, and so on.
Yeah, and it's sort of a standard test, a standardized test we used. I think it's called the I will be test or something like that.
Yes.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Developed back in.
If I can just add, we should probably also say it was done in a very last sample of Danes, a randomized, not randomized, but stratified sample of Danes between 20 and 70 years of age, and so it's a representative sample of Danes. I was thinking about 1,000 people who participated in this study.
I was going to ask you about your sample, if it was a random sample or.
It was a representative sample. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Huge. Last representative sample.
And how did you acquire your participants? Through an open survey, selecting through just a random data set? How did you get your participants?
No, we use, in this case, we contact a TNS Gallup. I think that is the official name. And this is this company that makes or helps some researchers and companies, private and public companies, to do research and to collect data.
Okay, so you used a company that would provide the random data, sample data for you.
The representative sample.
Yeah.
And so to make sure that it really was
representative.
You know, yeah.
And did you do these interviews via in vivo, on the phone, computer surveys? How did that happen?
This was a computer-based test, or like a questionnaire that they answer.
Okay.
It was without time constraint, and I think that it's important to say that although they collected the data, all the design and all the questionnaires came from us. Yeah.
Okay. And when you went into the research initially, what was your hypothesis going in?
Well, I think you stated that in the beginning, that a few minutes ago, that we following the literature and the sort of general assumption, we would assume that younger people with all their life ahead would project themselves further into the future than older folks. But we didn't find that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
right. Yeah. And I heard Sinue say that. I wasn't sure if you also expected that. So yes, the research showed you guys were expecting that to happen. So,
I think that it is difficult to say that. Of course, we were a little bit hesitant because there is some literature pointing towards a different assumption to what we actually found. But it's a more scarce literature saying that actually what we think about the future is more context dependent rather than age, and that this distance into the future with which people project themselves can vary based on multiple factors. So of course the hypothesis about not finding this negative correlation was present all the time, a little bit.
Sure. So you said that it's more concept related, not age related. Is that what you said?
Context related.
Context related.
Context related.
Okay, sorry.
Yes.
Context related. surprisingly, there was no difference in the findings between, say, a 20-year-old and a 65-year-old.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? I mean, you have the results, but why do you think that is?
I think that there are multiple explanations, but one of these, or the one that we address in the paper that you read, it is due to the positivity bias that we have, and that we always strive and focus on positive information rather than negative one, right? So when we're thinking about what are we going to become into the future, first, we don't want to think about the negative things. So that is the reason that maybe older people is avoiding this. I'm going to be sick and I'm going to be maybe death, which is the really, really bad thing to happen. And on top of that, we wanted to explore also like which mechanisms were behind this positivity bias that people have. And in the last section of the paper, we also address that we tried to do some exploratory analysis about what was this happening. And we actually discovered that positive future self-images that people were generating were driving more or less this closeness to the future, such as positive things were occurring like immediately in the next 3 to 4 years, whereas negative things were being pushed farther into the future. And because people generated more positive things or more positive concepts about themselves, then of course then this distance to the into the future was really, really short.
It's interesting, and I have to say I'm kind of surprised because as a practicing psychologist and working with a huge variation of people and age groups, and the news and the politics and everything going on in the world today, I get the sense that there's more anxiety, there's more depression, there's more fears, there's more stressors, there's more opioid use and alcohol use and whatnot. So I'm surprised that in your study you found that people are more future oriented, that they're more positively oriented and not worried about what's going to happen in our world today. Because the people maybe it's the population, because my profession, that I talk to people who are very concerned about the world, very stressed and anxious. But I think that's a good thing, right? It's enlightening that you're finding that people are more positive about their futures.
Yeah, it is a very consistent finding for healthy individuals or not non-depressed individuals, that people are generally, when we ask them also to generate imagined events in the future, they are generally very positive compared to when we ask for people's memories. So the future is brighter than the past, so to speak, in our way of thinking about it.
Yes, and did you screen out for physical and mental health issues for your population?
No, sadly no. But we consider that maybe that is a natural step to follow. And
but on the other hand, that's a good thing, because the fact that you didn't screen that out, you're getting the typical population, whereas anywhere from 10 to 18% of the population that you did test potentially had health issues. I don't know what the statistics are in physical issues, but certainly mental health issues. So that's surprising to me, that with a random sample, a representative sample of the population, that they still have this positive future orientation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. What was the most surprising thing that you found in any of the responses or any of the results that you looked at? Anything that really stood out for you as unusual?
Well, not precisely as unusual, but I think that when we were exploring these mechanisms behind, like what is driving this shortening into the future, is that this finding about like the positive being really close to present, whereas the negative is being pushed into the future. Although there is literature addressing that, we were not expecting that it was the case with future self-images per se. But that was a really, really surprising finding.
So give me an example of what you mean.
What I mean is that when you ask people like, oh, I'm going to be successful, or I'm going to be happy, healthier. I'm going to start with this new diet that is going to make me healthier. It's going to happen in the next 3 months or next year, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if something is going to be, I'm going to be sick, I'm going to become ill, that's going to happen farther into the future in 9 years' time. So I don't need to worry about that right now.
Well, and that might turn around in anxiety and some of the populations you mentioned, that if you have an anxiety disorder, highly worried, you might actually, some of the disturbance might be that you start to imagine these bad things happening next week. Because who cares about negative things 15 years from now? Well, it's sort of sad, but we don't have to think about it. But if you imagine it happens a year from now, then you start to worry.
About it.
So time is very important here.
Right. Interesting. And I want to talk about sort of that theory of positive psychology and how that might have an impact, or self-fulfilling prophecy, or some of the other theories that may be about in conjunction with this positive self-image and future orientation. But I also want to ask you, and I don't want to forget, of the research that you did and the findings that you found, is there any extrapolation or projection that you can do on outside of Denmark? In other words, do you think that the same data would hold true for Canadians or Americans or the French, etc.?
Yeah, the cultural differences. I think that is an interesting question, but given that this positivity bias, for example, or the findings that Dore was pointing out about like future being more positive than the past is being a well-established finding, I think that culture can be a potential factor, but I think that the findings will replicate actually.
And we just did, right? I mean, we just haven't published it. We have an American sense.
Ah, okay.
So
and so
they're just as
positive as Danish are.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Is there any population, any culture that you think might not fit that research mold in terms of positive future orientation?
I think it's really difficult about like because as Dore was pointing, like no one wants something bad happening in the next days or the next months to you, right? So I think that it's really difficult to find a culture or a place where people are actually expecting bad things happening, naturally occurring, unless these populations have some problems, like the psychological level. But if we need to think about something like that, I'm thinking about maybe cultures that are more like oriented towards the social, that are more socially oriented rather than self-oriented or like individualistic oriented. Maybe, I don't know if Chinese samples will maybe not differ, but maybe this difference that we find about the positive future versus the negative, it's gonna kind of like flatten a little bit, just because speaking out freely about like this individual, me, I'm gonna be better. Maybe it's going to be not as well received or perceived by others. So therefore, maybe I'm going to just balance out the negative with the positive.
Or maybe these other cultures would generate different self-images, like I will be more family-oriented.
Exactly. That is
still
true.
Would be very positive, but less about me and my career. And So it's an empirical question.
So the focus might be different in terms of
it might be
instead of myself, it could be more family oriented, oriented. Interesting.
I would be a good son, I would be a good daughter, rather than I would be a successful student. I don't know, but
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I agree with you. That would be that's perhaps your next future research.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on Silver Sage Magazine this morning.